Picture this: a sudden hailstorm so violent it flattens entire armies, or a sky so eerily dark at noon that birds stop singing and people flee in terror. Weather doesn't just shape our days, it's rewritten history in ways so bizarre, so utterly unexplainable, that even centuries later, we're left scratching our heads. From raining fish to blood-red snow, the skies have unleashed phenomena so strange they've toppled empires, sparked revolutions, and left entire civilizations questioning the very fabric of reality. And today, we're diving into 25 of the most jaw-dropping, spine-tingling weather events ever recorded, moments when nature didn't just break the rules, it ripped them to shreds. Think about the last time you got caught in an unexpected downpour. Maybe it ruined your picnic or forced you to dash for cover. Now imagine that rain wasn't water but frogs. Or that the wind wasn't just strong, it was powerful enough to lift entire houses into the air like toys. These aren't scenes from a fantasy novel. They're real, documented moments when the weather crossed into the realm of the unbelievable, leaving behind stories so surreal they've been passed down through generations. Some of these events were seen as divine signs, others as curses, but all of them defied logic and left an indelible mark on the people who witnessed them. What if I told you there was a day when the sun vanished for months, plunging the world into a cold, endless night? Or that a single lightning strike once decided the fate of an entire nation? These aren't just odd footnotes in history, they're proof that nature has a dark, whimsical sense of humor. And as we unravel these 25 mind-bending mysteries together, you'll see how weather didn't just accompany history, it shaped it. So buckle up, we're about to journey through time where the skies were anything but ordinary and the forecast was always unpredictable. In 1816, summer never came. Instead, the world shivered under an endless grey sky as snow blanketed fields in June and frost withered crops in July. This wasn't just a freak cold snap, it was a climate catastrophe triggered by a volcanic explosion so massive it dimmed the sun itself. Just a year earlier, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with a force 10 times stronger than Krakatoa, spewing enough ash into the atmosphere to block sunlight across the globe. Temperatures plummeted, crops failed, livestock starved, and in Europe and North America, desperate farmers watched their fields turn to wastelands under unseasonable ice. The consequences were apocalyptic. Food prices skyrocketed as grain supplies vanished, sparking riots from Switzerland to New England. In Ireland, famine drove families to eat nettles and roots to survive. In China, summer frosts killed rice paddies, triggering floods of refugees. Even the natural world seemed to unravel. Birds migrated out of season, and reports described eerie, blood-red sunsets caused by volcanic dust scattering the light. But amid the suffering, something extraordinary happened. Trapped indoors by relentless rain during a gloomy Swiss holiday, a young Mary Shelley and her friends huddled by the fire, telling ghost stories to pass the time. The endless winter outside became the backdrop for her nightmare, a tale of a scientist defying nature's laws, stitching life from death. That story, Frankenstein. Shelley's masterpiece, born from the bleakness of 1816, mirrored the world's fragility. Just as her monster was a patchwork of stolen parts, The Year Without a Summer revealed how interconnected and vulnerable humanity truly was. A single volcano on the other side of the world could plunge millions into hunger, inspire art, and rewrite history. And yet, this wasn't nature's wrath, just its indifference. The skies didn't punish, they simply shifted, leaving humanity to reckon with the aftermath. The winter of 1709 didn't just arrive, it attacked. Europe awoke to a cold so savage it seemed to defy the laws of nature. Rivers turned to stone, trees split open with cracks like gunshots as sap froze inside them. Wine barrels exploded in cellars, their contents hardening into crimson ice. Even the air became lethal. Birds plummeted from the sky, frozen solid in mid-flight, their wings outstretched as if still grasping for a warmth that no longer existed. This was the Great Frost, a catastrophe so extreme it didn't just break records, it shattered the very rhythm of life. France, already straining under the weight of the War of the Spanish Succession, found itself fighting on two fronts against enemy armies and the sky itself. Soldiers, accustomed to the horrors of battle, now faced a new torment, fingers blackened by frostbite, breath turning to ice on their lips. Supply lines collapsed as wagons froze to the ground, leaving troops without food or fuel. The Seine became a highway of ice, but no one celebrated. The river's freeze meant trade networks, the lifeblood of cities, were severed. In Versailles, King Louis XIV's opulent court shivered beneath their furs, their breath visible in halls where candles guttered out in the unnatural cold. The Sun King's power meant nothing to the weather, but the true devastation struck the countryside. Peasants, already burdened by war taxes, watched their last defenses, their crops and livestock perish overnight. Orchards that had thrived for generations were reduced to skeletal wreckage. Starving families burned furniture for warmth, then tore apart their own homes when the wood ran out. In London, the Thames froze so thickly that frost fairs sprouted on its surface, a macabre carnival atop the ice while beneath the gaiety, the poor died silently in alleyways. The frost didn't just kill people, it reshaped history. With armies immobilized and economies in ruins, the war's momentum fractured. Negotiations stalled as diplomats struggled to focus on borders while their own citizens starved. Some historians argue the cold prolonged the conflict, grinding it into a brutal stalemate that drained nations already pushed to the brink. Others see it as a grim equalizer, nature's reminder that no kingdom, no matter how powerful, could outlast its wrath. What makes the Great Frost so haunting isn't just its brutality, it's the eerie familiarity. In an age before climate science, people searched for meaning in the ice. Was it divine punishment, a cosmic omen? Today, we know it was likely a freak anomaly in the Little Ice Age, a climatic blip with global repercussions. But for those who lived through it, the frost wasn't just weather. It was a reckoning, a warning etched in ice, whispering that even the mightiest human plans are no match for a single, merciless winter. At first, it looked like rust staining the rooftops, a faint reddish tint clinging to walls after an afternoon shower. But by July 25, 2001, the people of Kerala, India, knew this was no ordinary storm. The rain fell in thick, crimson sheets, staining clothes scarlet and turning puddles into pools that looked like diluted blood. Some described the liquid as sticky, with an almost metallic smell hanging in the air. Within hours, panic rippled through the region. Religious leaders called it a divine omen. Scientists scrambled for answers, and the world watched as the skies unleashed what became known as the blood rain of Kerala. Theories erupted faster than the rain itself. One camp pointed to the desert. Winds from Arabia, they argued, could have carried red dust from the Sahara or the Arabian Peninsula across the Indian Ocean, tinting the rainfall. Satellite images did show dust clouds moving over the region that summer, a plausible explanation for the eerie color, but others weren't convinced. The rain wasn't just discolored. Residents reported odd, gelatinous clumps in the water, unlike anything dust alone could produce. That's when the speculation took a turn toward the extraterrestrial. A team of researchers, led by physicist Godfrey Louis, made a startling claim. The red particles in the rain, they said, weren't mineral dust at all, but biological cells. Under a microscope, the particles resembled microorganisms, lacking DNA yet seemingly capable of replicating under extreme heat. Louis suggested they might be spaceborne microbes, hitchhiking to Earth on a comet or meteorite. The idea of alien life seeding the planet through rain wasn't just science fiction anymore. It was a hypothesis, however controversial, backed by lab results. Skeptics pushed back. Other scientists identified the particles as algae spores, specifically a type called Trentipolia, common in the region and known to turn red under stress. The alien cells, they argued, were likely terrestrial organisms caught in an unusual atmospheric cycle. But the mystery deepened when researchers found no traces of the algae's DNA in some samples, leaving room for doubt and fascination. What's undeniable is the cultural shockwave the blood rain triggered. In Kerala, where folklore is rich with omens and portents, many saw the event as a divine warning or a curse. Some linked it to local political unrest, others whispered of ancient prophecies. The rain became a Rorschach test, a phenomenon so strange that people projected their deepest fears onto it. Even today, the debate isn't fully settled. Was it dust, algae, something beyond our understanding? The blood rain reminds us that nature doesn't just defy expectations, it revels in them. And sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries aren't just about the facts, they're about what we believe when the sky refuses to make sense. The fog crept into London on December 5, 1952, not as the romantic Dickensian mist the city knew so well, but as something far darker, a thick, yellowish-grey smothering that reeked of sulfur and soot. At first, no one panicked. Londoners were used to pea soupers, the dense fogs that rolled in from the Thames, but this was different. By morning, visibility dropped so low that pedestrians couldn't see their own feet. Buses crawled behind conductors walking ahead with flares, their flames barely piercing the gloom. Birds dropped dead mid-flight, suffocated by the air. And then the coughing began. A deadly cocktail of weather and human negligence had conspired to create this catastrophe. A high-pressure system parked over the city, trapping cold air beneath a layer of warmer air, a phenomenon called an inversion. Normally, smoke would rise and disperse, but this time it was pressed downward, mingling with the freezing mist. The result, a poisonous blanket of coal smoke from millions of chimneys, diesel buses, and coal-fired power plants. Sulfur dioxide levels soared to 7 times normal, transforming the fog into airborne acid. It seeped into homes, hospitals, and schools, burning lungs and turning stairwells into gas chambers. The toll was horrifying. Official records initially listed 4,000 deaths, but modern research suggests the true number was likely 12,000 or more, with 100,000 more falling severely ill. Morgues overflowed, undertakers ran out of coffins, victims collapsed in the streets, their respiratory systems ravaged by the toxic air. The smog even penetrated indoor spaces, killing cattle at a livestock show and blinding theatergoers when the fumes ate through the curtains. Yet for days, the government downplayed the crisis. Newspapers buried reports on back pages, calling it unusual fog. It wasn't until a coroner's inquest declared the smog a major disaster that officials acted. The tragedy became the catalyst for the Clean Air Act of 1956, which banned coal burning in urban areas and reshaped environmental policy worldwide. What makes the Great Smog so chilling isn't just its body count, it's how easily it could have been prevented. London had ignored warnings about air pollution for decades. The disaster proved that nature doesn't need volcanoes or blood rain to wreak havoc. Sometimes it simply amplifies humanity's mistakes. The skies didn't turn toxic on their own. We handed them the poison and they gave it back with interest. By January 1684, the cold had claws. The Thames, London's pulsing vein of trade and life, had become a solid, glittering slab of ice. Temperatures plummeted so low that the river froze nearly 2 feet thick, a depth unheard of in living memory. But what's truly astonishing isn't just the ice, it's what Londoners did with it. Instead of retreating indoors, they flooded onto the river's surface, transforming a disaster into the grandest winter carnival history had ever seen. The Frost Fair erupted like a mirage. Enterprising vendors dragged entire stalls onto the ice, selling roast meat, hot ale, and souvenirs stamped with the date to prove you'd witnessed the spectacle. Printers set up presses right on the river, churning out commemorative pamphlets as crowds skated past. a makeshift street of tents stretched for miles, lit by bonfires where men toasted their boots, some literally drinking the river dry, tapping kegs embedded in the ice. There were puppet shows, sled races, even bull baiting. For a few surreal weeks, the Thames wasn't a waterway. It was a frozen promenade of vice and revelry, where aristocrats and beggars rubbed shoulders on equal footing. But beneath the merriment, the freeze was strangling the city. With ships trapped in port, London's economy seized up like a rusty clock. Coal shipments couldn't reach the capital, sending fuel prices soaring. Fresh food vanished from markets as supply chains snapped. The poor suffered most. Those who couldn't afford firewood burned furniture, then door frames, then floorboards. The ice wasn't just a novelty, it was a noose tightening around the neck of a metropolis utterly dependent on its river. The fair's grotesque irony, the very thing that made it possible, the brutal cold, also made it deadly. When the thaw finally came in February, the river didn't just melt, it shattered, swallowing tents, carts, and unlucky revelers in violent cracks. Bodies washed up downstream for weeks, some still clutching frost fair trinkets in their stiffened hands. The frost fairs were a testament to human resilience and recklessness. Londoners partied atop the same ice that starved them, a contradiction as sharp as the wind that carved it. This wasn't just weather, it was climate chaos weaponized by geography. The Thames froze repeatedly during the Little Ice Age, but the 1684 event was the last truly great frost fair. Later freezes never matched its scale, partly because warmer winters returned, but also because London rebuilt its bridges with narrower arches, speeding the river's flow and making it harder to solidify. The frost fair became folklore, a cautionary tale of what happens when nature flips the script. One day, the Thames was a highway, the next a carnival ground, then, just as suddenly, a grave. The ice gave and the ice took, and London learned too late that no amount of merriment could thaw a city frozen to its core. The night of October 15, 1987, began quietly across southern England, just another autumn evening with a weather forecast mentioning breezy conditions. By midnight, those breezes had morphed into something monstrous. Hurricane-force winds, later confirmed to reach 115 miles per hour, slammed into the coast with the fury of a freight train. The great storm didn't just arrive, it annihilated the quiet assumption that Britain was immune to such extremes. Meteorologists would later call it a weather bomb, an explosive cyclogenesis that intensified faster than any model predicted. The storm's eye carved a path of destruction from Cornwall to Kent, its winds ripping rooftops like tissue paper, hurling cars into ditches and flattening entire forests. 15 million trees, some centuries old, crashed down in the darkness, their roots no match for the tempest. Ancient oaks that had survived world wars were reduced to splinters in minutes. The iconic wrong forecast became etched in public memory when BBC presenter Michael Fish famously dismissed warnings hours earlier, chuckling, "Someone's just called to say a hurricane's on the way." Well, don't worry, there isn't. Nature's response was merciless. The human toll was staggering. 18 lives vanished in the chaos, crushed by collapsing buildings, falling debris, or drowning in storm surges. Power lines snapped like twigs, leaving 500,000 homes in blackout. Cliffs crumbled into the sea, and seaside towns awoke to find piers twisted into abstract art. Yet amid the devastation came eerie moments of surreal beauty. In London's Kew Gardens, the storm yanked a 200-ton steel greenhouse door from its hinges and tossed it like a playing card. What transformed the Great Storm from tragedy to turning point was its legacy. Britain's weather forecasting system, caught off guard by the storm's speed, underwent a radical overhaul. New supercomputers, Doppler radar, and a culture of caution replaced old complacency. The storm taught a brutal lesson: nature doesn't follow human assumptions. Today, when forecasters warn of severe weather, the ghost of 1987 lingers, a reminder that preparedness isn't paranoia. It's the price of underestimating the sky. But perhaps the storm's most haunting lesson was how easily modernity unravels. For all our technology, a single night of wind reduced cities to candlelit medieval villages where neighbors huddled together sharing batteries and blankets. The Great Storm didn't just reshape Britain's landscape, it exposed how fragile our grip on control really is and how quickly the weather can snatch it away. The wind carried the soil away first, not in gentle wisps, but in towering black walls of dust that swallowed the horizon whole. By the spring of 1934, America's Great Plains had become a wasteland where the very air turned against its people. This wasn't just drought, it was an ecological apocalypse, a self-inflicted catastrophe born from optimism turned reckless. Decades of aggressive plowing had ripped up the native grasses whose roots once held the prairie together. Now, with no anchors left in the earth, the land simply dissolved. Dust storms rolled across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas like biblical plagues. They blotted out the sun for days, creeping into homes through cracks as thin as thread, coating everything: food, beds, lungs in a fine, suffocating grit. Children wore dust masks to school. Cows choked to death mid-chew, their stomachs packed solid with dirt. Farmers, desperate to salvage something, watched their fields rise into the sky, carried eastward by winds so relentless they dumped Great Plains soil onto ships in the Atlantic Ocean. The land wasn't just dying, it was vanishing, one gust at a time. The human toll was staggering. Over 2.5 million people fled the Dust Bowl, their cars packed with mattresses tied to roofs to block the dust, their headlights cutting through perpetual twilight. These weren't migrants, they were refugees, though no one called them that yet. They streamed westward along Route 66, chasing rumors of work in California's orchards, only to find fences and hostility. John Steinbeck immortalized their despair in The Grapes of Wrath, his Joad family a symbol of thousands who discovered that poverty clung as stubbornly as the dust they'd left behind. But here's the cruel twist: the Dust Bowl wasn't an act of God. It was the result of human arrogance meeting natural consequence. Homesteaders, lured by promises of rain follows the plow, had ripped up drought-resistant prairie grasses to plant wheat. When prices crashed, they tore up even more land, trying to farm their way out of debt. Then the rain stopped, not for a season, but for years. The very technology that broke the plains' gas-powered tractors could plow 10 times faster than horses became the instrument of their undoing. Government response swung from denial to drastic action. Hugh Bennett, a soil scientist, famously stalled a congressional hearing on erosion until a dust storm blackened Washington's skies, proof no politician could ignore. His work birthed the Soil Conservation Service, which taught farmers contour plowing and crop rotation. Windbreaks of trees were planted like stitches across the wounded land. The lessons were hard-won. Nature doesn't negotiate, you adapt or you perish. The Dust Bowl's legacy isn't just buried in history books. It whispers in every satellite image of shrinking aquifers, every wildfire fueled by invasive grasses. It's a warning etched in parched earth: civilization isn't a conquest. It's a negotiation, one where the land always gets the last word. The heat came like an invisible siege, locking Chicago in a suffocating grip from July 12 to July 16, 1995. Day after day, temperatures soared past 106 degrees Fahrenheit, but the real killer wasn't just the sun, it was the humidity, turning the air into a wet, heavy blanket that smothered the city. By week's end, 739 people lay dead in morgues, most of them elderly, poor, or forgotten by the systems meant to protect them. This wasn't just a heat wave. It was a massacre of neglect. At first, the city dismissed the danger. Heat didn't crumple buildings like tornadoes or drown streets like floods. It killed quietly, behind closed doors, in apartments without air conditioning where single rooms became ovens. The victims weren't struck down in the streets. They withered in isolation, their bodies failing as thermostats ticked upward. Medical examiners reported corpses so hot they accelerated decomposition. some with internal temperatures of 109 degrees at depth. The heat warped railroad tracks, melted tar on roofs, and buckled roads, but the most grotesque distortions were societal. Neighborhoods with leafy parks and sprawling suburbs weathered the storm with pools and icy drinks. But in Chicago's poorest districts, especially the south and west sides, the heat exposed a fractal map of vulnerability. Black residents died at nearly twice the rate of white residents. Many lived in heat islands, concrete jungles where asphalt and brick absorbed the sun's rage by day and radiated it back all night, offering no respite. Some couldn't open windows for fear of crime or feared the cost of running fans would bankrupt them. Others, like 82-year-old Edna Stewart, perished alone in apartments where no one checked on them for days. The true horror lay in the institutional failures. City officials, including Mayor Richard M. Daley, initially downplayed the crisis, refusing to declare an emergency until bodies overwhelmed the morgue. Cooling centers sat half empty because transportation wasn't provided. Newspapers buried heat deaths in back pages, framing them as inevitable summer tragedies rather than systemic collapses. Even the power grid, strained by millions of air conditioners, failed in cascading blackouts, yet another betrayal. But amid the carnage, glimmers of humanity flickered. Strangers broke into apartments to rescue neighbors they'd never spoken to. Volunteer groups delivered water to the homebound. These acts laid bare a bitter truth. The heat wave didn't create Chicago's inequalities, it scalded them into visibility. The aftermath forced reckoning. New cooling systems, buddy check programs, and revised emergency protocols emerged. Yet the deeper lesson lingers: disasters are never truly natural. They're mirrors reflecting who a society values and who it abandons when the mercury rises. Chicago's dead weren't casualties of weather, they were casualties of indifference. And the next heat wave, whenever it comes, will test whether their deaths taught us anything at all. The sky turned green an hour before the wind hit, a sickly, unnatural hue that made sailors clutch their amulets and whisper prayers. By the time the Great Hurricane of 1780 roared across the Caribbean on October 10th, it wasn't just a storm, it was a biblical reckoning. With winds estimated at over 200 miles per hour, it flattened entire towns, uprooted centuries-old mahogany trees like weeds, and hurled warships onto rooftops miles inland. When the sea finally stilled, 22,000 lives had vanished, a death toll unmatched by any natural disaster in Atlantic history. Naval crews bore the brunt of nature's fury. British Admiral George Rodney's fleet, anchored off St. Lucia, lost every ship but one. The HMS Thunderer, a 74-gun behemoth, was tossed onto the island's cliffs like driftwood, its cannons silenced forever. Nearby, a French convoy carrying 5,000 soldiers sank without a single survivor. The storm didn't discriminate. Dutch, Spanish, British, and American vessels all met the same watery grave. Saltwater-soaked letters later washed ashore, their ink blurred into ghostly confessions of men who'd survived battles only to drown in the dark. On land, the destruction defied comprehension. In Barbados, where the storm made landfall, stone buildings crumbled into pebbles. Forts designed to withstand cannon fire were reduced to rubble. The hurricane surge drowned entire plantations, burying sugar fields under 10 feet of seawater mixed with corpses. Enslaved Africans, already trapped in brutal conditions, died in disproportionate numbers, locked in barracks that became tombs when the floodwaters rose. The hurricane's timing reshaped geopolitics. With European fleets decimated, American privateers seized the advantage, crippling British supply lines during the Revolutionary War. Naval strategists, once fixated on enemy firepower, now obsessed over barometers. The storm exposed a humbling truth: no empire's might could outmaneuver the wind. But the most haunting legacy, the silence afterward. No bird sang for weeks. The sea, strewn with splintered hulls and bloated bodies, stayed eerily calm, as if even nature needed to catch its breath. The Great Hurricane didn't just kill, it rewrote the rules. After 1780, sailors no longer saw storms as mere obstacles. They saw them as executioners. And the Caribbean, once a chessboard for empires, became a graveyard where ambition met the abyss. Farmers in New South Wales first noticed the dust in 1902, tiny, relentless particles creeping into every crevice of their homes, no matter how tightly they sealed the windows. Then came the winds howling across the drought-scorched outback, lifting the topsoil into swirling pillars of black that blotted out the sun. These weren't ordinary dust storms. They were black blizzards, monstrous walls of dirt so dense they turned day into night, choking livestock, burying fences, and leaving entire towns gasping under a suffocating shroud. The worst hit on November 12th, when a tempest of dirt 200 miles wide swept across eastern Australia. Witnesses described an apocalypse. Trains stalled as tracks vanished under drifts of dust. Children tied handkerchiefs over their faces to walk home from school, and clocks struck noon under skies so dark that street lamps flickered to life at midday. The dust wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. Doctors reported cases of dust pneumonia, where victims coughed up clods of earth until their lungs failed. Sheep, their wool matted with grime, collapsed from sheer exhaustion, unable to graze in the particulate haze. But the horror didn't end with the storms passing. The blizzards exposed a deeper crisis, the reckless overgrazing and land clearing that had stripped the fragile topsoil of its natural anchors. Without roots to hold it down, the earth simply evaporated. Decades of colonial farming practices designed for wetter European climates had turned Australia's interior into a powder keg waiting for the wind. Then, 70 years later, history repeated itself with a surreal twist. On September 23, 2009, Sydneysiders woke to an eerie orange glow seeping through their windows. The city's iconic skyline had vanished behind a swirling curtain of red dust, blown in from drought-stricken inland deserts 800 miles away. The harbour bridge gone, the opera house swallowed whole. Cars, buildings, even the air itself took on a rusty hue as the dust settled like Martian snow. Health warnings blared as air pollution levels skyrocketed to 50 times beyond safe limits. Flights were grounded, emergency rooms flooded with asthma cases. What made this event so uncanny wasn't just the spectacle, it was the symbolism. The red dust storm struck during the Millennium Drought, a decade-long dry spell that crippled Australian agriculture. Like the black blizzards before it, this was nature's bill coming due, a vivid reminder that ignoring the land's limits has consequences. But there's a cruel irony to these antipodean disasters. While the black blizzards of 1902 were largely ignored by urban elites, the 2009 storm forced modernity itself to pause. Stock traders in skyscrapers coughed into their sleeves. Tourists snapped photos of a Sydney that looked post-apocalyptic. The dust didn't discriminate this time, it punished everyone equally. Both events share a terrifying lesson. Droughts don't just starve the land. They weaponize it, and when the wind rises, even the most advanced cities are just sandcastles waiting for the tide. On the morning of June 30, 1908, a nomadic reindeer herder named Semyon Semenov was sipping tea outside his tent in Siberia when the sky split open. A blinding blue-white streak tore across the heavens, followed by a shockwave so powerful it hurled Semenov off his feet. 20 miles away, another witness described a fire that divided the sky, then a series of thunderous explosions that knocked grown men flat as trees snapped like toothpicks all around them. What followed wasn't just a storm, it was an apocalypse in miniature. The Tunguska event remains one of history's most violent cosmic mysteries, flattening 800 square miles of forest with a force equal to 185 Hiroshima bombs. Yet to this day, no one fully agrees on what actually happened. The scale of destruction defied belief. Millions of trees lay scorched and uprooted in a radial pattern, their trunks pointing outward like spokes from an invisible wheel at ground zero. Seismographs across Europe recorded tremors equivalent to a 5.0 earthquake. Nights turned eerily luminous as dust particles high in the atmosphere scattered sunlight, allowing Londoners to read newspapers outdoors at midnight. But when scientists finally reached the remote site 19 years later, they found no crater, no meteorite fragments, just a wasteland of splintered timber and a handful of microscopic silicate spheres embedded in the soil. This absence of physical evidence sparked a century of debate. The leading theory suggests a stony meteorite, roughly 120 feet wide, exploded 5 miles above the Taiga in an airburst so intense it vaporized the rock before impact. The pressure wave alone would have leveled everything below, mimicking a nuclear detonation. But comet proponents point to the glowing night skies as proof icy cometary debris, they argue, could have dispersed high in the atmosphere to create the eerie luminescence. Others propose even wilder ideas, a chunk of antimatter annihilating on contact with our atmosphere, or a mini black hole passing through Earth like a bullet through smoke. One thing's certain, had the object arrived 4 hours later, it would have obliterated St. Petersburg, killing millions. Instead, it chose one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth, a stroke of cosmic luck that turned Tunguska from a human tragedy into a scientific goldmine. The event rewrote astronomy's playbook, forcing researchers to confront the reality of planetary defense. Today, NASA tracks thousands of near-Earth objects, haunted by the realization that the next Tunguska won't announce itself with a warning. It'll just arrive, and whether it's ice, rock, or something stranger, the only thing we can predict is that we won't be ready. What lingers isn't just the scientific mystery, but the eerie parallels to modern threats. The Tunguska airburst was nature's prototype for the atomic bomb, an unclaimed weapon reminding us how fragile civilization really is. The forest has regrown now, hiding the scars under fresh branches. But the lesson remains carved into the permafrost. Sometimes disaster doesn't come from wars or plagues, but from the cold, indifferent sky. And when it does, all we can do is hope it misses. Rain fell for 43 days straight, not as gentle showers, but as a ceaseless, drowning fury that stripped hillsides bare and sent rivers boiling over their banks. By January 1862, California was drowning under its own sky. What began as ordinary winter storms mutated into a catastrophe so vast it reshaped the very geography of the West. The Central Valley, a fertile basin the size of Vermont, became an inland sea 300 miles long and 20 miles wide. Towns vanished underwater. Ranches became islands, and Sacramento, the state capital, watched as its streets transformed into canals where rowboats replaced carriages. This wasn't just a flood. It was a continental sneeze, nature resetting the balance after years of gold rush greed had scarred the land. The numbers still stagger historians. An estimated 4,000 people perished more than died in the San Francisco earthquake 44 years later. Entire communities like Mokelumne City were erased from the map, their buildings washed downstream in a slurry of mud and splintered timber. In the Sierra foothills, gold mines became death traps as flash floods buried miners alive in their own tunnels. One witness described the American River boiling like a cauldron, its currents so strong they uprooted 100-year-old oaks and hurled them like battering rams through towns. But the flood's true devastation was economic. California, already reeling from the collapse of the gold rush, now faced ruin. The state government, housed in Sacramento's leaky Capitol building, went bankrupt, unable to pay employees or service debts. Agriculture collapsed as topsoil washed away, leaving behind salt-encrusted wastelands. The disaster exposed a cruel irony. The very rivers miners had diverted and polluted now exacted their revenge, swallowing the infrastructure of greed whole. What makes the Great Flood haunting isn't just its scale, it's how quickly memory faded. Within a generation, Californians rebuilt on the same floodplains, convinced engineering could defy nature. Hydraulic mining resumed, choking rivers with debris until another catastrophe, the flood of 1881, forced reform. The lesson was clear: water always wins. Today, satellite photos still reveal the ghostly outlines of 1862's inland sea beneath California's farmland, a submerged warning that the past isn't past. It's just waiting for the next storm, yet the flood left one unexpected gift. The same deluge that destroyed gold mines deposited fresh sediment in the Central Valley, creating some of the richest agricultural soil on Earth. California's second act as America's breadbasket was born from its worst disaster. The flood giveth and the flood taketh away, but never on terms we expect. The year 535 dawned under a sun that refused to shine. Across the world, from Constantinople to China, chroniclers recorded the same eerie phenomenon, a dim, copper-colored orb hanging in a sky that stayed dark even at noon. Summer never warmed, frost gripped fields in July, crops withered before they could fruit, and famine crept through civilizations already teetering on the edge. This wasn't just a bad year, it was the beginning of a climate nightmare that would last 18 months, reshape continents, and possibly unleash the deadliest plague in history. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica tell the story in layers of sulfuric acid. Around 535, a volcano erupted with such cataclysmic force that it dwarfed even Tambora or Krakatoa. Some researchers point to Indonesia's Krakatoa as the culprit. Others argue for an undocumented eruption in the Americas. Whoever the culprit, the aftermath was global. The volcano's ash veil blocked enough sunlight to drop temperatures by as much as 4 degrees Celsius, enough to kill growing seasons across the planet. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a perpetual eclipse, while Irish monks scribbled desperate notes about bread failing in the land and the sun's light as feeble as the moon's. The dominoes fell fast. In Mesopotamia, the Persian Empire's grain stores rotted in unseasonable rains, sparking riots that weakened King Khosrow's grip on power. China's northern provinces reported summer snowfall so heavy they collapsed roofs, followed by locust swarms descending on the few surviving crops. The Mayan city-states, already straining under drought, saw their reservoirs dry up completely. Archaeologists later found mass graves from this period, filled with skeletons bearing signs of violent conflict over dwindling resources. Even the nomadic tribes of Central Asia felt the sting, as grasslands vital for their herds turned to dust, pushing them toward Roman borders in waves that would later reshape Europe. But the most terrifying consequence may have lurked in the shadows of this cold, hungry world. In 541, just 6 years after the skies darkened, the bubonic plague erupted in Egypt before racing across the Mediterranean. The Plague of Justinian, as it became known, killed an estimated 25 million people, half of Europe's population at the time. Recent research suggests the climate chaos of 535 created the perfect breeding ground for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. Rodent populations, forced to migrate closer to human settlements in search of food, likely carried infected fleas into cities already weakened by malnutrition. The volcano didn't just starve empires, it may have armed the microbe that shattered them. What makes this event so chilling is its quiet lethality. Unlike hurricanes or earthquakes, the disaster unfolded in slow motion, a creeping, invisible enemy that poisoned harvests, frayed social bonds, and left civilizations vulnerable to the next blow. The world didn't realize it was under siege until the bodies began piling up. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. 535 stands as a grim reminder that climate isn't just about weather, it's the thread holding together everything we call civilization. Cut it and the whole tapestry unravels, and sometimes the deadliest disasters aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that whisper as the light fades from the sky. On May 19, 1780, New Englanders watched in horror as the morning light faded to an unnatural twilight, then vanished entirely by noon. Birds fell silent, livestock staggered in confusion, and across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, families huddled around candlelit tables, convinced the apocalypse had arrived. The dark day wasn't just an ordinary overcast afternoon. It was a suffocating blackness so total that newspapers later reported men unable to see their own hands at arm's length, and midnight-level darkness lasting for 18 unnatural hours. Theories about its cause spiraled wildly at the time. Some ministers declared it Judgment Day, pointing to biblical prophecies of the sun being turned to darkness. Others blamed supernatural forces or even Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity. But science offers two compelling explanations, each as eerie as the next. The first points to wildfire smoke not from local blazes, but from colossal forest fires burning hundreds of miles away in Canada's Algonquin wilderness. Tree ring studies reveal 1780 was a drought year when vast stretches of Ontario's forests became tinderboxes. Wind patterns that may suggest smoke could have funneled southward, trapping a thick, high-altitude haze over New England that filtered out sunlight like a cosmic dimmer switch. The second theory ventures even further into the unknown. Some researchers propose a solar anomaly, a massive sunspot or coronal mass ejection, might have temporarily disrupted Earth's atmosphere. Historical records from the same period note unusually vivid auroras visible as far south as Cuba, suggesting heightened solar activity. If charged particles bombarded the upper atmosphere, they could have interacted with ozone to create a dense, light-blocking smog. What makes the dark day unforgettable isn't just the science, it's the psychological terror it ignited. Diaries from the time describe neighbors gathering in churches to pray as animals exhibited bizarre behavior. Cows returned to barns on their own, and crickets chirped at midday as if night had fallen. In the Massachusetts legislature, lawmakers adjourned in panic, with one colonel reportedly declaring, "The day of judgment is at hand, and I wish to be found doing my duty." Even skeptics like Abraham Davenport, a Connecticut politician, acknowledged the dread when he famously refused to adjourn court, stating, "I choose, for one, to meet my duty, whether it be day or night." The strangest twist, when the darkness finally lifted the next morning, sunlight revealed an eerie detail. Rain puddles had turned yellow, as if the sky itself had been stained by whatever passed overhead. No one ever definitively solved the mystery. Was it smoke, a solar storm, something else entirely? The dark day endures as a reminder that nature doesn't need earthquakes or hurricanes to unsettle us sometimes. All it takes is the simple, terrifying act of turning off the lights. The stillness before the storm was deceptive. Just another February afternoon in New England with gray skies hinting at snow. But by dusk on February 6, 1891, the barometer at Blue Hill Observatory near Boston was plunging at a rate so drastic, the staff scrambled to check their instruments for errors. They weren't broken. What followed wasn't merely a blizzard. It was a snowfall so relentless, so suffocating, that by the next morning, the observatory's roof had vanished under 54 inches of snow, a record for the most snowfall in a single day that still stands unchallenged over a century later. No one saw it coming. Weather forecasting in the 1890s relied more on folklore than science, and the few telegraph reports from ships at sea offered little warning. The storm bombarded New England with hurricane-force winds, hurling snow horizontally in such thick waves that observers at Blue Hill described it as being buried alive in a white avalanche. Drifts climbed to 20 feet, swallowing houses up to their second-story windows. Trains froze solid on their tracks, their smokestacks buried. Telegraph lines snapped like twigs, cutting off entire towns from the outside world. Boston's streets became labyrinthine trenches where pedestrians risked being lost forever if they ventured out alone. What made the Great Blizzard extraordinary wasn't just its ferocity, it was its precision. While Boston drowned under 5 feet of snow, towns just 30 miles away saw barely a dusting. the storm's bullseye, Blue Hill, where Superintendent Henry Helm Clayton and his team documented every detail with near-obsessive rigor. As the snow piled higher, they took turns shoveling paths to their instruments, determined not to miss a single measurement. At one point, the wind ripped the observatory's anemometer clean off its mount, yet they kept recording, even as the building groaned under the weight of the snow. Their data became a Rosetta Stone for meteorologists, proving that storms could intensify explosively under the right conditions, a phenomenon now called bombogenesis. The aftermath was surreal. Bostonians awoke to a city transformed, where horse-drawn carriages were replaced by dog sleds and skis. The economic toll was staggering. Factories shut down, ports froze over, and the citrus trade collapsed as Florida-bound trains sat stranded in snowbanks. But amid the chaos, the blizzard sparked a revolution. Blue Hill's meticulous records became the foundation for modern snowstorm prediction, and the disaster forced cities to rethink emergency preparedness. Snowplows, once rare, became municipal necessities, yet the storm's legacy is bittersweet. That unbroken snowfall record, it's not just a trophy, it's a warning. Climate models suggest warmer oceans could fuel even more extreme nor'easters, turning freak events into recurring nightmares. The 1891 blizzard didn't just bury a city, it unearthed a truth we're still grappling with today. When nature decides to rewrite the rules, all we can do is take notes and hope we survive the lesson. The wind began as a whisper, a faint, uneasy rustling through the mangrove forests of the Ganges Delta on November 8, 1970. By midnight, that whisper had become a scream. The Bowler cyclone, a monstrous Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, slammed into what was then East Pakistan with the force of 1,000 freight trains. But the real killer wasn't the wind, it was the water. A storm surge 20 feet high roared inland like a liquid bulldozer, swallowing entire islands whole. When the sun rose on November 13th, 500,000 people were dead. Bodies clogged rivers for weeks, villages had vanished without a trace, and in the wreckage of this annihilation, something unexpected stirred, a revolution. The geography of the disaster made escape impossible. The Ganges Delta, a vast network of low-lying islands and tidal flats, acted like a funnel for the surge, amplifying its height as it pushed into crowded coastal communities. On Haisha Island, eyewitnesses described waves taller than coconut palms sweeping away entire families clinging to trees. Fishing boats were hurled miles inland, left stranded in rice paddies like grotesque sculptures. The storm's timing couldn't have been crueler. It struck at high tide during a full moon when waters were already at their peak, but the true horror lay in the aftermath. With roads washed away and telegraph lines down, help couldn't reach survivors for days. Starving crowds looted grain stores. Parents drank brackish floodwater to stay alive while their children died of thirst beside them. What turned this catastrophe into a political earthquake was the response or lack thereof. The Pakistani government, based 1,000 miles away in West Pakistan, downplayed the death toll and sent woefully inadequate aid. A single helicopter, just one, was dispatched to survey the damage initially. When President Yahya Khan finally visited 9 days later, he infamously quipped, "What's all the fuss about?" That callous indifference ignited smoldering resentment into open rebellion. East Pakistan had long felt like a neglected colony, its Bengali majority treated as second-class citizens. Now, with corpses still floating in the streets, a young politician named Sheikh Mujibur Rahman seized the moment, declaring the cyclone proof that East Pakistan could no longer rely on Islamabad. His Awami League won a landslide election weeks later, demanding autonomy, a demand met with brutal military crackdown. The stage was set for the Bangladesh Liberation War. Meteorologists now recognize the Bowler cyclone as a watershed moment in disaster preparedness. Its unimaginable toll exposed how poverty, poor infrastructure, and political neglect turn natural hazards into mass tragedies. But its legacy is more than statistical. It's a stark lesson in how weather doesn't just destroy. Sometimes it dismantles empires. The storm didn't just kill 500,000 people, it birthed a nation. And in that grim duality lies nature's cruelest irony. The same winds that erase one world can herald the next. Residents of the Spanish town of Gelino woke to a sight straight out of a nightmare in 2007. Not raindrops pattering against their windows, but hundreds of live earthworms slithering down from the sky. The slimy invertebrates coated cars, rooftops, and sidewalks, their writhing bodies glistening under the overcast sky like something from a biblical plague. Local meteorologists scratched their heads. There'd been no storms, no tornadoes, not even strong winds to explain how terrestrial creatures ended up airborne. Some villagers crossed themselves, whispering about divine warnings. Scientists proposed a different culprit, a rare atmospheric phenomenon called a wind scoop, where small whirlwinds lift lightweight objects from the ground before depositing them elsewhere. But worms, these weren't leaves or dust. They were living creatures with no business falling from the heavens. 3 years later, and 1,000 miles east, Serbia faced its own zoological oddity. In 2010, the town of Lazevac found itself blanketed not by snow or rain, but by millions of spiderwebs, gossamer sheets draping trees, fences, and power lines like a ghostly shroud. At first glance, it looked like an early Halloween decoration gone rogue, but then the webs moved. Tiny spiders swarmed within the silken threads, ballooning on air currents in a mass migration event so dense it transformed the landscape into something out of a horror film. Arachnologists explained it as a natural if unsettling phenomenon, baby spiders releasing silk strands to catch the wind, a behavior called ballooning. But the scale was unprecedented, turning entire fields into undulating seas of silk. Locals joked about needing snow shovels for spiderwebs. The devout saw darker signs. Both events share eerie similarities: biological material raining down where it shouldn't, sparking equal parts scientific curiosity and primal unease. History is littered with such accounts: fish tumbling onto Norwegian villages, frogs pelting Hungarian farmlands, even a documented shower of starfish over Scotland in 1892. The most plausible theory: waterspouts or tornadoes acting as nature's vacuum cleaners, sucking up creatures from ponds or fields before dropping them miles away. Yet some falls defy even this explanation, like the Gelina worms, found nowhere near the type of open, moist soil required for a whirlwind to hoist them. What makes these events linger in collective memory isn't just their strangeness, it's how they expose the limits of human understanding. Science can explain the mechanisms, but not always the randomness. A tornado doesn't discriminate between a minnow and a worm when it lifts its haul skyward. And when those creatures land among us, the line between the explicable and the miraculous blurs. Centuries ago, such falls were recorded as omens. The year Rome burned, chroniclers swore blood and meat rained from the sky. Today, we reach for meteorology textbooks instead of prayer books. But the unease remains the same, because deep down we all wonder, if worms can fall from nowhere, what else might the sky let go? Floridians were sipping lemonade under palm trees one day and scraping ice off their oranges the next. February 1899 delivered a freakish slap of winter to the Sunshine State, so bizarre it still feels like a meteorological prank. Arctic air plunged southward with unprecedented aggression, painting Key West with frost and dusting Miami with actual, honest-to-goodness snow. This wasn't just a light dusting. Jacksonville got buried under 1.5 feet, Tampa Bay froze solid enough for ice skaters, and across the peninsula, citrus farmers watched helplessly as their life's work turned to frozen pulp on the branch. The Great Freeze didn't just break records, it shattered Florida's very identity as a tropical paradise. The human toll was heartbreaking. Orange groves, the backbone of Florida's economy, were obliterated. Trees split open with cracks like gunshots as sap expanded into ice. Workers tried lighting smudge pots to warm the groves, but the cold was too relentless. By dawn, entire orchards stood blackened, their fruit glazed like macabre Christmas ornaments. The industry wouldn't fully recover for years, forcing growers to migrate southward toward what's now the Orange Belt. But the real surrealism played out in the animal kingdom. Iguanas, those sun-worshipping reptiles synonymous with Florida's heat, tumbled from trees in a reptilian rain, their cold-blooded bodies shutting down mid-perch. Alligators, masters of swamp survival, were found frozen stiff in shallows, their snouts poking through ice like prehistoric sculptures. Even manatees, those blubbery giants of the Gulf, succumbed in shocking numbers, their bodies washing ashore like casualties of an invisible war. What made this event so unnerving wasn't just its intensity, it was its geography. Snow in Tallahassee, rare but plausible. Snow in Palm Beach, that's like finding penguins in the Sahara. The freeze exposed how precariously balanced ecosystems and livelihoods really are. One atmospheric hiccup, one wobbly dip of the jet stream, and suddenly flamingos are standing on ice. Yet the disaster had an unexpected silver lining. The freeze catalyzed Florida's shift from small-scale farming to large agribusiness, as only wealthier growers could afford to replant and innovate. It also spurred early research into frost-resistant citrus, a legacy still vital today as climate change looms. The 1899 freeze wasn't just a fluke. It was a rehearsal, and as Arctic air grows increasingly unstable, Florida's icy past might just be a preview of winters yet to come. The winds howling across Lake Michigan on October 8, 1871 weren't just strong, they were ferocious. Mariners called it the Great Gale, a storm so violent it sank 30 ships and stranded another 90 on reefs and beaches from Chicago to Green Bay. But what made this tempest truly historic wasn't just the wreckage it left on the water. It was the inferno it helped ignite on land. That same night, while Chicago burned in the infamous fire that would dominate headlines, another disaster unfolded 250 miles north, one far deadlier yet often forgotten. The Peshtigo fire didn't just burn, it devoured. Flames driven by the same hurricane-force winds that churned the Great Lakes leapt across 1.2 million acres in mere hours, incinerating entire towns and leaving behind a death toll 10 times higher than Chicago's. The science behind this deadly synergy is chilling. The Great Gale's winds, exceeding 100 miles per hour, acted like bellows on a landscape already tindered dry from months of drought. Lumberjacks had littered northern Wisconsin with slash piles, dry branches left behind after logging, while farmers cleared forests with intentional fires. When the gale hit, these scattered embers became firebrands, hurled through the air like flaming arrows. Witnesses described tornadoes of fire spiraling across fields, igniting whole communities in minutes. In Peshtigo, desperate survivors plunged into the river to escape the heat, only to boil alive as the water grew scalding from the surrounding inferno. The firestorm generated its own weather pyrocumulus clouds that rained ash and sparked new fires miles ahead of the main blaze. By dawn, 1,200 people were dead, including entire families reduced to bone fragments in root cellars where they'd sought refuge. Yet history barely blinked. Chicago's fire, though smaller in scale, captivated the nation with its dramatic images of urban chaos, skyscrapers collapsing, crowds fleeing across bridges. Peshtigo, it was a remote working-class region, its victims largely immigrant lumber workers whose deaths barely registered in the press. Even the storm's role was overlooked. The Great Gale became a footnote, remembered mainly by Great Lakes historians, while the fire it fueled was framed as a freak accident rather than part of a larger climatic chain reaction. But modern meteorologists see a darker pattern. The same high-pressure system that drove the gale's winds also created the drought that primed the land to burn. This wasn't coincidence, it was climate synergy. Today, as wildfires again rage with historic fury, the lessons of 1871 feel unnervingly relevant. A single weather event can unleash multiple disasters, and our collective memory often favors the spectacular over the truly catastrophic. The Great Gale and the Peshtigo fire weren't just tragedies, they were a warning written in smoke and wind, one we're still learning to read. On June 1st, 1638, New England's Puritans awoke to a world unraveling. The ground beneath their feet shuddered violently, tossing furniture like kindling and cracking freshly built chimneys. Before the terrified colonists could even murmur prayers for deliverance, an unnatural darkness swallowed the sky, not from clouds, but from a horizon choked with towering pines bent nearly double by a wind that roared like the voice of God himself. This wasn't just an earthquake, it wasn't merely a hurricane, it was both striking in unholy unison, a hybrid disaster so unprecedented that ministers scribbled frantic sermons about divine wrath while the very earth split open beneath their meeting houses. Contemporary accounts read like passages from Revelation. Governor John Winthrop's diary describes how the quake's tremors coincided exactly with the hurricane's arrival, timing so precise it defied natural explanation. Houses already wobbling from seismic shocks were then flattened by winds strong enough to rip iron hinges from door frames. In coastal settlements like Plymouth, survivors told of a nightmare tide surging inland, not in the rhythmic pulse of normal waves, but in a single, monstrous wall of water propelled by the quake's subsidence and the storm's fury. The sheer improbability of these dual disasters left even the most rational minds questioning whether the events were cosmically linked, or if the New World itself was rejecting them. The scientific explanations uncovered centuries later only deepened the uncanny horror. The earthquake, likely centered near New Hampshire's seacoast, registered between 6.5 and 7.0 in magnitude, strong enough to topple poorly constructed colonial homes on its own. But its timing overlapped with the peak of a tropical cyclone barreling up the Atlantic coast, its eye-wall grazing Cape Cod with Category 3 winds. Modern meteorologists now recognize this as a freak juxtaposition, not causation, two independent disasters colliding by chance. Yet for the Puritans, who saw tempests and tremors as divine signals, the synchronization felt deliberate. Cotton Mather later cited the event as proof of God's displeasure with Sabbath breakers, while less devout settlers whispered of ancient native curses lingering in the soil. Archaeology offers eerie corroboration. Excavations near colonial era wells in Massachusetts reveal layers of hurricane-driven sand sandwiched between earthquake-fractured bedrock, a geological sandwich of catastrophe. But the most haunting relic, a survivor's hastily scribbled note found preserved in a church cellar, its ink blurred by salt water. The earth opened its mouth and the sea answered. What makes 1638 unforgettable isn't just the violence, it's the vulnerability it exposed. The colonists had crossed an ocean to tame a wilderness, only to discover that nature here didn't play by European rules. Their sturdy English oaks snapped like twigs in winds unlike anything recorded back home. Their stone foundations crumbled under quakes unheard of in London. The disaster became a turning point, forcing adaptations like deeper root cellars and hurricane-resistant timber framing, tiny concessions to a land that would always hold the upper hand. Yet the event left another legacy buried deep in America's cultural DNA. The Puritans' obsession with deciphering divine messages from weather and geology evolved into a uniquely American fascination with natural omens, one that echoes today in everything from tornado-chasing YouTube channels to earthquake preparedness drills. The hybrid disaster of 1638 didn't just reshape buildings, it reshaped minds, teaching a harsh lesson. In this new world, the ground could betray you and the sky could scream at you in the same breath. And sometimes, the only thing louder than the wind was the silence of a universe indifferent to prayers. The ground groaned first, a deep, guttural sound that rattled teeth and sent livestock stampeding in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1811. Then the earth convulsed so violently that church bells rang in Boston, 1,000 miles away. The New Madrid earthquakes weren't just tremors, they were geological screams, a series of quakes so powerful they temporarily reversed the Mississippi River and rang like a struck gong across a third of the continent. But the real eeriness wasn't confined to the ground. The skies themselves seemed to revolt, painting the disaster with strokes of supernatural horror that left even hardened frontiersmen whispering about divine judgment. Witnesses reported sulphurous stenches wafting from fissures, as if the underworld had cracked open and exhaled. Others described flashes of light dancing along the horizon, not lightning, but eerie glows resembling distant fires or auroras, now believed to be earthquake lights, electrical phenomena sparked by grinding tectonic plates. The river, normally a sluggish giant, became a frenzied beast. Sandbars erupted like geysers, spewing coal-black water and uprooted trees. Near the epicenter, the Mississippi's flow reversed for hours, its current sucked backward as the land itself buckled. Boats were stranded miles inland as the river abandoned its banks, while waterfalls briefly appeared where the riverbed had been thrust upward. But the most terrifying detail: the quake struck in winter, yet the air turned unnaturally warm. Survivors wrote of sudden, unseasonable heatwaves between tremors, as if the Earth's fury had leaked into the atmosphere. Trees snapped not just from shaking, but from steam explosions within their trunks, their sap flash boiled by subterranean heat. Even the weather seemed broken. Weeks after the main shocks, Kentucky settlers observed dry fogs, hazy, sun-obscuring veils that no amount of wind could disperse, likely loaded with volcanic gases seeping from fractured bedrock. Scientists now classify the New Madrid sequence as some of the most powerful quakes in U.S. history, estimating magnitudes between 7 and 8. Yet what lingers in folklore isn't just the raw destruction, it's the uncanny sensory overload. This wasn't an earthquake as we imagine it today. It was a full sensory haunting, the reek of sulfur, the sky's false dawns, the river's defiance of gravity. The land didn't just move, it performed, rewriting the rules of physics and chemistry in real time. Modern researchers still puzzle over the event's atmospheric theatrics. The sulfur smell, possibly hydrogen sulfide released from crushed shale. The earthquake lights, stress-activated minerals generating electrical charges. But for those who lived through it, explanations didn't matter. The earthquakes became a cosmological reset button, proof that the land itself was alive, capricious, and far stranger than any frontier legend. And when the Mississippi finally resumed its flow, it carried more than water. It carried a warning: this ground doesn't belong to you, it tolerates you. And when it decides to shake you off, even the sky will bear witness. The snow shouldn't have been a surprise, not in a Russian December. But what the advancing Nazi troops saw through the whiteout on December 5, 1941, made even battle-hardened officers question their sanity. There, shimmering like a phantom through the blizzard's veil, stood the golden domes of the Kremlin, impossibly close. The sight sent a jolt through the German ranks. Moscow, their prize, lay just ahead undefended, its towers tantalizingly within reach. Soldiers scrambled for binoculars, commanders recalculated maps, and for a brief, hallucinatory moment, the Third Reich's eastern campaign seemed on the brink of triumph. Then the vision dissolved, swallowed by swirling snow. The Kremlin had never been there at all. This wasn't just a trick of the light, it was an Arctic mirage, a rare atmospheric fluke called a fata morgana. Unlike desert mirages where heat bends light upward, these polar illusions occur when cold air near the ground traps warmer layers above, creating a natural funhouse mirror that stretches and warps distant objects. Under the right conditions, landmarks hundreds of miles away can appear unnaturally close, hovering just beyond the horizon like spectral projections. For the Germans, already disoriented by weeks of brutal cold and Soviet resistance, the effect was psychological dynamite. Some tank crews reportedly lurched forward, convinced the city's defenses had collapsed. Others froze, whispering about Bolshevik sorcery. The delay, however brief, proved catastrophic. Historians still debate how much this optical illusion altered the battle's course. Soviet records confirm the Nazis' vanguard stalled for critical hours that day, regrouping instead of pressing their thinning advantage. By the time they realized their mistake, fresh Siberian divisions transferred from the Far East after Stalin learned Japan wouldn't attack had fortified Moscow's outskirts. The Nazis, their supply lines stretched to breaking point, found themselves battling not just the Red Army but the coldest winter in 50 years. Temperatures plunged to -40, freezing diesel fuel, shattering rifle bolts, and turning even shallow trenches into icy coffins. The snow mirage became a cruel metaphor for Hitler's entire Eastern campaign. Victory always just out of reach, dissolving into the howling wind. Yet the real mystery isn't whether the mirage happened, it's why it mattered so deeply. German meteorologists had warned about Arctic mirages. Their field manuals even described them, but hubris blinded the Wehrmacht. They'd expected a quick conquest, not a winter war, and their troops wore summer uniforms in December. The Kremlin's ghostly apparition exposed a fatal flaw in Nazi logic. You can't outmaneuver what you refuse to understand. The Soviets, raised on stories of Napoleon's frozen retreat a century earlier, grasped the land's ruthlessness. Their soldiers, clad in quilted telegraphers and felt boots, became phantoms of their own, melting into blizzards, ambushing columns that couldn't even see them. Science now knows the Moscow mirage wasn't supernatural, just ice crystals bending light. But history remembers it differently, as the moment the Russian winter first whispered to the invaders in a voice both beautiful and terrible that they were already lost. The snow didn't just hide the Kremlin, it mirrored the Reich's own delusions, showing them exactly what they wanted to see, until the truth, like the cold, became inescapable. King Philip II of Spain had envisioned a swift, glorious conquest. His mighty armada, 130 ships strong, would sail up the English Channel, escort invasion barges from the Netherlands, and crush Protestant England under Catholic heel. But the summer of 1588 had other plans. As the Spanish fleet maneuvered near the English coast, an unrelenting tempest rose from the North Atlantic, hurling gale-force winds and towering waves against the wooden behemoths. These weren't just any storms, they became immortalized as the Protestant winds, a name dripping with both awe and divine irony. To the English, it was divine intervention; to the Spanish, a cosmic betrayal. The storm's brutality defied even seasoned sailors' experience. Ships snapped masts like twigs, their hulls battered by waves that climbed higher than castle walls. The Spanish formation, already strained by English fire ships, fractured completely under nature's assault. Vessels were driven onto the rocky coasts of Ireland and Scotland, their survivors slaughtered or enslaved by locals. The once proud armada, now a scattered wreck, limped home with fewer than half its ships. The irony cut deep. Spain's empire, built on New World gold and invincible galleons, had been humbled not by English guns alone, but by the very winds that once filled their sails with promise. But the storm's impact rippled far beyond shipwrecks. England's victory, painted as a Protestant miracle, galvanized Europe's religious divide. Pamphleteers proclaimed God had breathed upon the waters to defend the Reformation, turning weather into propaganda. The Spanish, meanwhile, whispered of witchcraft, their priests interpreting the disaster as divine chastisement for the Armada's sins. The political fallout was seismic. Spain's aura of invincibility cracked, its treasury drained by the failed campaign. England, emboldened, pivoted toward naval dominance, planting seeds for an empire that would eclipse Spain's. The deeper mystery lies in the storm's timing. Modern climatology reveals the late 16th century as the peak of the Little Ice Age, when Arctic cooling triggered violent North Atlantic weather. The Armada didn't just face bad luck, it sailed into a climatic perfect storm. Yet history remembers it as fate, not meteorology. The Protestant winds became a legend, a story where nature didn't just change the course of a battle, it rewrote the narrative of an era. And perhaps that's the greatest power of weather. It doesn't just shape events. It decides who gets to tell the tale. The tornado didn't zigzag or meander like most. It carved a scar across the earth with surgical precision, a 3-hour rampage that defied every rule storms were supposed to follow. On March 18, 1925, the deadliest tornado in U.S. history didn't just touch down. It plunged through Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana like a runaway freight train, maintaining an unprecedented forward speed of 73 miles per hour while stretching an unbelievable 219 miles from start to finish. Tornadoes typically dance across the landscape in unpredictable spurts, lasting minutes and covering a few miles at most. This one behaved like something else entirely, a force of nature that forgot to fade. Eyewitnesses described a black, boiling mass over a mile wide, its funnel not just dipping from sky to ground but pressing downward like a monstrous hand. Survivors in the town of Murfreesboro, Illinois, swore they heard no traditional freight train roar, just an eerie, deafening silence before buildings exploded around them. The physics of it still baffles meteorologists. Tornadoes derive energy from wind shear, requiring a delicate balance of warm and cold air to sustain themselves. This one should have choked and dissipated dozens of times over its path. Instead, it fed on some freakish atmospheric loophole, gulping down instability like a predator that refused to be full. Modern simulations suggest it may have been a long-track supercell, a rare storm system that continuously regenerates its rotation, but even that theory doesn't fully explain its vicious stamina. The human toll was apocalyptic. Entire blocks in Gorham, Illinois, vanished so completely that search parties found nothing but bare concrete slabs where homes once stood. Schools collapsed with students inside. A train was hurled off its tracks near Parrish, its cars crumpled like toy wagons. 700 people died that day, many in close-knit communities where generations were wiped out in minutes. The tornado's speed left no time for warnings. Families sitting down to supper suddenly found themselves airborne. Some carried half a mile before tumbling back to earth in fields strewn with splintered lumber and the corpses of neighbors they'd waved to that morning. What makes the tri-state tornado more than just a historical tragedy is its unsettling modernity. Despite advances in radar and early warning systems, a storm moving at 73 mph would still outrun most alerts today. Its freakish straight-line path challenged everything scientists thought they knew about tornado behavior, forcing a rewrite of meteorological textbooks. Before 1925, people assumed tornadoes couldn't cross rivers or survive more than a few miles. This one leaped the Wabash River without slowing and ignored terrain that should have disrupted it. In its wake, the U.S. Weather Bureau, predecessor to the National Weather Service, finally acknowledged the need for tornado forecasting, a field previously dismissed as superstition. Yet the storm left another legacy, one etched in the silence of empty lots where towns once thrived. Murfreesboro never fully recovered its population. Petersburg, Indiana, moved its entire cemetery after the tornado unceremoniously dumped corpses from shattered graves into the streets. The disaster exposed how fragile human settlements really are against a sky that decides to rewrite the rules. And perhaps that's the tri-state's darkest lesson. Sometimes nature doesn't just defy physics. It defies sense, leaving behind not just rubble, but questions that still twist in the wind a century later. From vanishing armies to blood-red rains, history's weirdest weather events don't just defy logic. They expose how thin the line between order and chaos really is. We've seen hailstorms flatten empires, hurricanes birth nations, and volcanoes rewrite entire seasons from half a world away. These aren't just meteorological oddities. They're reminders that no matter how advanced we become, nature holds a trump card, and it plays without warning. Consider the paradox. Humanity's greatest triumphs often coincide with our most humbling defeats. The same icy winds that froze Nazi tanks outside Moscow once fueled revolutions in the Caribbean. The same rains that drowned California's gold rush later fertilized its farmlands. Weather doesn't just disrupt history, it molds it, revealing our fragility while forcing adaptation. The dark day of 1780 taught colonial America to respect the sky's mysteries. The tri-state tornado shattered myths about storm behavior, spurring modern meteorology. Even now, as satellites track every cloud and algorithms predict storms weeks in advance, the lesson remains: control is an illusion. The next world-altering event could be brewing right now, in a silent magma chamber, a swirling pressure system, or a dust speck floating high enough to seed the next ice age. But here's the thrilling part: these stories belong to all of us. Every culture carries whether legends, tales of phantom storms, miraculous rains, or omens written in the clouds. Maybe your grandparents survived a freak blizzard with folklore-worthy details, or your hometown has a local myth about rivers running backward during a quake. That's where you come in. Drop your wildest weather stories in the comments. The stranger, the better. After all, history isn't just written in books. It's etched in tree rings, buried in flood layers, and whispered in the wind that just knocked over your trash cans. The sky never stops telling stories. We just have to listen.